Welcome everyone to Pants on Fire, Exposing Ruling Class Lies. In today's episode, we are talking to Emily from Beijing, and the topic of discussion is China and the myth of the debt trap. So welcome, Emily.
Hi, Kyle. I'm so glad that I could be on here. I've been listening to your previous episode and I'm a big fan.
Well, we're so glad that you were able to join us, and I think we should just probably get right into it. So let's talk about what's going on with China and its lending practices. And what we're hearing in the Western media, obviously, is that China is creating so-called debt traps for poor countries, particularly in Africa and Southeast Asia. And so let's start with a little bit of background on that. And what does that mean? What is a debt trap?
So the debt trap, although it's been like a buzzword these days, the things that are similar to what has been designated as debt trap has been happening for a long time. So it's basically debt trap is when you put someone, or in this case, a developed country, into so much debt that is unrepayable, and through this you gain control of that person's livelihood or that country's economy and resource, that kind of stuff. This has been happening ever since the 70s, 80s, 90s. Basically, every cycle of the capitalist economic crisis is happened in countries in the Southeast Asia and Latin America. It has been happening again and again, but debt trap wasn't a buzzword back then. I've actually looked it up. So debt trap so when you search debt trap diplomacy, it points you to all of this narrative about China and stuff. But if you just search debt trap, it basically, if you search that on Wikipedia, it basically goes to good old usury and not something about sovereign debt. That got me thinking, because everything that I can search about debt trap diplomacy came up after 2017. And when is 2017? 2017 was basically when China's Belt and Road Initiative really started to take off. And I happen to have a friend who's an international trade law scholar, and I happen to help her research on the Belt and Road Initiative. And I was like, that seems like much of a coincidence. So I looked into it. So basically so the connection of debt trap and diplomacy and China happened in 2017, and it was really recent. But we know the things like that have been happening and have been caused by Western countries all the way back into 70s, 80s, but no one talked about it. It wasn't a whole hot narrative back then. It was only a hot narrative now since China started to do their Belt and Road Initiative.
Mm-hmm. So let's back up a little bit then, because we should probably talk about the Belt and Road Initiative a little bit. And also, I wanted to ask you to briefly introduce yourself, and I neglected to ask you to do that. So let's start with that. Just tell us a little bit about yourself and the kind of work that you do, and who you are and that kind of thing.
Oh, for sure. So I'm Emily. I'm a Chinese American woman and currently living in Beijing. I'm doing my postdoc in China. Well, I am a researcher of neuroscience, not really economics or trade law, but I have an interest in that. And since I grew up in China in my youth, I speak and read Chinese, that I have access to narratives that are different from what we generally see in the mainstream in English language media and propaganda. So I am a CPUSA member. I joined CPUSA in 2020, and amidst all the ruling class lies about China. And I'm now a member of the Peace and Solidarity Commission of CPUSA. And yeah.
So you grew up in the US and you're studying in Beijing?
Well, I grew up in China in my youth.
Okay.
And I went back to the US in my adulthood, lived there for like a decade or so.
So let's talk a little bit about the Belt and Road Initiative for those who may be a little fuzzy on what exactly that is.
Sure. So the Belt and Road Initiative was something that China put forth in the it started from before 2017, but it really started to be picked up during 2017, and a lot of countries signed it. So Belt and Road Initiative is basically the belt is the Silk Road economy belt that is basically like a land-based economy that goes from China to what all the way from west to China, like the old Silk Road in history. So it's basically like economy and construction cooperation project. And the road is the Marino Silk Road is basically going from China to all the way to southeast and stuff. But it doesn't necessarily limit to those two directions. In fact, in 2017, 2018, a lot of countries, even as far as Italy, signed some agreements with China on joining the Belt and Road Initiative. And we know that it is an initiative, so it's mutual. It's basically China just bring up this idea, and the other parties they can agree to it or not agree to it, basically stuff like that. And I believe it was in 2017 or 2018 that China signed a pretty huge agreement with many participating countries, laying down some of the principles of Belt and Road Initiative. Is basically what this is used for. It's mostly used for infrastructure and collaborations on real economy. So basically, in socialist term, helping the other nations to do modernizations, and basically everyone gets modernized and develop their economy, and we can trade together. That benefits everyone. One very important part of that agreement is sustainability of the project. So basically, China will either lend money or sign agreements with them to build infrastructures, and they must maintain that these lendings are sustainable. China doesn't want it to be unrepayable. So basically, that just the debt traps kind of thing just goes out of the window.
And so what we hear a lot in some of the critiques of the Belt and Road Initiative are that they're creating these debt traps, one, and that they're also it's a way for China to expand its political influence throughout the developing world. And then there's also concerns about impacts to the environment. And so what we're hearing obviously is the capitalist side of the argument. I wonder if you could speak to the reality of the types of improvements that the Belt and Road Initiative has been making so far.
Oh yeah. So one part of this allegation against China is that China lends so much money, so it makes you think that in the foreign debts of those countries, China, the debts held by China consists of like a majority, and it is basically, and so it's mainly China that's been the government that's been lending so much money to them, and and then gaining control of those countries' assets. One example is Sri Lanka, whose the Hambantota International Port project. It was basically, now the port is being used by China because Sri Lanka failed to pay the debt. So people basically think, wow, this is a prime example of China gaining control of foreign assets. But something that they didn't know is that one, that port was proposed by Sri Lanka. It's not proposed by China, and China didn't force them to build the port. And China didn't seize it. China rented. They paid rent to use that port, so they didn't even seize that asset. And in reality, if we look at the actual composition of foreign debt of those countries, we realize that sure, Western governments, they don't consist of like a majority of that country's debt, but China's debt also only consists of like about 10 to 15% of that. Where did the majority of their debt and the growing portion of that debt come from? Is from market borrowing. Where did that market borrowing come from? I mean, China doesn't really do private lending to foreign countries. The market borrowing was held by Western private creditors. And that is something that most mainstream media doesn't really report on.
So there's more to the story than what we hear, and that's not surprising. And I guess the foreign debt conversation in general, the distinction here is that the US and other Western European countries are doing that through other means besides the direct government lending. Is that right?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay,
And
so
when I've once looked at a statistics that's done by Financial Times, and it says that compared to IMF and foreign IMFs and Western government lending, China's lending have higher interest rate and consists of a higher percentage. And I was like, how is that possible? So I actually looked into it, and I found out that they were comparing China to the lendings of IMF and Western countries, when in fact Western countries isn't like the major lenders to these countries. They do that through private institutions. So basically, our ruling class hides behind private institutions that gives them all of these lendings, and it's growing and growing, and it has higher interest rate. So from where I have seen, average interest rate of Western private institution is usually 5%, and average interest rate of China is less than 3%, and with occasional waivers and forgiveness in between. So if you look at news, non-English news, you can sometimes see when China's diplomats and leaders visit foreign countries, they sign agreement, and sometimes they forgive a huge swath of debt. But you don't really see that on English language media, don't you?
yeah, so that's the thing. So they have a lower interest rate. They're working with the countries and building infrastructure that those countries want and those countries need. And I guess the critique that we hear is that, like you said, it's going to be impossible for the countries to pay the debt back. And it is interesting coming from our Western media, in that the way they're spinning it, it's almost like the way they talked about the housing crisis here, that it was loans that the banks knew people weren't going to be able to pay back. And there's definitely some similarities to that argument. They're saying, like, look, this country in Africa, there's no way it's going to be able to pay this debt back. And what that means is they're going to default. And when that happens, China's going to seize those assets. But there's been cancellations as well of debt.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if China really want to get them in debt, want them to default, why do China always forgive their debt and delay their payments, stuff like that?
So it does seem like they are working with the countries and really in some cases being extremely forgiving with this debt. So what is the main motivating factor, do you think, for China's Belt and Road Initiative, and why did it start really picking up in 2017?
Sure. Yeah. So I think that is part of the that come directly after part of the assessment by the CPC and the Chinese government about the primary contradiction, or in this case, we can say it's basically a directive of what's the problem that China is facing and how can we solve it. So one of the things that they want to do is to cooperate with foreign countries and to develop the economy of the less developed parts of China. And a large swath of those regions are landlocked. For example, the so-called western part of China. Mm-hmm. They are connected to a lot of other landlocked countries, such as Kazakhstan, Mongolia, all of Middle East, stuff like that. Yeah, I mean, the Middle East isn't landlocked, but they're connected with the landlocked part of China. And historically, there is a tradition of during the Tang Dynasty, and sometimes even after that. During the Tang Dynasty, China have had a lot of trade relationship with regions western to it, and it has a huge, marvelous historical legacy. So basically, riding on that spirit, China proposed that although a lot of those countries west to China are, still developing. They wanted modernization, and China said we can provide that, and we can do cooperations with you so to boost you and our underdeveloped regions, so that we can flourish together, that kind of stuff. So it is not just to solve the problem of that China is facing, but also China proposed this human race collective. I need to look up what that is called. Sorry, wait a second. So it's called a community of shared future for mankind. So China has seen that its road of development is tied together with the future of mankind, of all surrounding countries and every country in the world. So by developing their own economy, by helping surrounding countries developing their own economy, the whole world will benefit from a better modernized real economy. And through trade, everyone can develop together, that kind of stuff.
And so it did seem when I was doing a little preliminary research that this did kind of get started a little earlier than 2017, but we didn't really start hearing about it until around that time.
Yeah, because 2015 throughout 2017 and 18 is when they started to sign a lot of agreements.
And so
I believe that. So
yeah, and so I think it does speak to what you're saying about the real economy and about how the humanity in general benefits from cooperation and working together, which is international solidarity. And I think that some of the arguments against it are obviously coming from like the BBC, NPR, and things like that. But just while we were talking, I just looked, because out of curiosity, how much debt the U.S. is in, how much debt the U.S. owes to China. And according to NPR, China owns $981 billion in U.S. debt. And so, it may be that there's a connection there, that
oh man, that's a whole nother case. China started buying a lot of U.S. debt after 2008, and at that time the U.S. needed China to buy those debt. And in this case, this is completely different from from lending. This is completely different from lending to developing countries, because the U.S. foreign debt isn't the money isn't used to pay back their debt, or used for the U.S. to develop itself. Develop our hospitals, our roads, our railroads. But those lendings were to prop up the hegemony, the credit of the U.S. dollar.
And so the case of Debunking specifically,
and since recently China, and I guess Japan too, have been have been selling away some of U.S. debt, and right now our ruling class is really panicking.
Yeah, and I think that panic is probably a lot to do with what we're seeing. And there are some organizations out there that are publishing articles that kind of give the other side of the argument, or at least don't take a really blatant stance in this is bad. And the positive aspects of this are really hard to ignore. I mean, they're talking about potentially lifting entire populations out of poverty.
And China have the experience of doing that.
It almost seems like I think we probably both know what the reality is that the U.S. and Western hegemony in general feels threatened by this type of thing, that China's doing something good and profit is not their primary concern.
Yeah, I mean, as Michael Parenti said, one of U.S. policy's goal is to, one, support countries that open to multinational corporate investors and allow the U.S. to take their resource, or even depend on the U.S.-based, economic hegemony to take their resource, take super profit from them. And the other is to crush any government or leaders or countries that try to develop their own independent economy. And we have seen that happen again and again. The U.S. will make up resource start a war over it, crush some governments, and left that country in ruin because no one is allowed to be independent from the hegemony.
And I think that's such a different system when you really just, obviously it is, but I think for a lot of people in the West, the idea of empathy and compassion and doing something without the primary motivator being to rip somebody off, basically, to profit. It's hard to fathom that, which is sad.
Yeah, it's really ingrained in our mindset that our country is doing the right thing. We're the default right thing, the standard of doing the right thing. But if you really think about, even if you don't really think about it in terms of empathy or solidarity, if you look at how China's economy is composed and how U.S. economy is composed, you realize that these countries benefit from very different things. Just look at it from a profiting or developing kind of idea. So the reason that China isn't doing or cannot do that kind of thing is because China does real economy. They don't have the kind of financial control and the control over international rulemaking bodies that the US have. So China wanted their neighbors to modernize, because if everyone gets modernized, everyone really takes their advantage and do their own thing, everybody can trade, and this is good for China and for the others, for the other parties. China doesn't benefit from trapping other countries in debt because China cannot have financial control over them. While our ruling class, our U.S. capital, U.S. government, they have control over the price of resource. They have control over rulemaking bodies and international institutions such as the IMF, and they can put clauses that will be able to make the countries that are in debt to them, make them reform, make them open up their financial market. They can put the economy of those countries under its thumb, while China does not have the means to do that. But our media plays it up so that people think China have this, mysterious control over this country, while China does not.
I think that's such an important distinction to make between the real economy and the financial economy.
Yeah.
Because you're right that the economy in Western terms is really kind of separated from, in most cases, like the actual exchange of goods and services. It's financialized. It's like,
yeah,
you're making
at this
money
rate, yeah, at least at this rate, especially during the post-COVID couple years, we really see that the U.S. is under a lot of problem with inflations and stuff. So the way that the U.S. gains super profit from other countries is basically through, because all of the currencies in the world is connected somewhat to U.S. dollar, and U.S. dollar is tied to the prices of crucial resources such as petroleum. So it's what we call petrodollar. So through instigating conflicts, the U.S. can make capital go to and fro from other countries, and during the course of that, gaining super profit from just crushing the economy of other countries, seizing their goods and resources, and the cycle goes all over again.
Right. So one of the distinctions to make is that one of the claims is that China holds more debt in developing countries and at a higher interest rate. But you say that what the US and the Western countries, while they don't directly participate, we have these private holders. So can you talk about these private holders? Who are these people, these private holders?
Oh yeah, so the private holders are multinational corporations that does nothing else but investment into foreign countries. And so we've probably heard about BlackRock. That is one of the example of private investors. And what these institution does is they lend money to the developing countries that are already in debt. So these investments were done for them to basically pay the debt that they're already in. And I think that tracks back to so money lended from a Western private creditors are usually used to pay off older debt, which ultimately tracks to the years of underdevelopment caused by Western colonialism, which is why these kind of things often happens in, for example, Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America.
Mm-hmm.
So these are one source of the non-governmental lendings, which is through private investors such as BlackRock. And the other source is international banks such as IMF and such, and Asian Development Bank. So if take the IMF, for example, what they did to Argentina back when is a prime example of how these kind of default can basically get a country into deeper control of the US economy. So basically they will sign these agreements, but with restrictive clauses attached. So if the debt is not paid off, the countries are usually forced to make the financial reform to basically opening up their financial market and make it easier for foreign capital, i.e. those private investors that I've been talking about, make it easier for them to take in and see super profit from those countries. So all of these kind of work together, and our government, while not providing direct lendings to them, our government provides the policies that make it possible for the investors to go out and be those vultures.
Mm. And so I think this is where we get into the super profit and maybe the crux of the issue here is that the US and Western countries are competing against China in this debt growth kind of these types of initiatives. And so China's got a lower interest rate and less strings attached and less restrictive clauses, and the US doesn't like that.
Because if that come to pass, the developing countries, they'll have infrastructures, maybe even newer roads, railroads, better hospitals than what we can have in the US. If they do that, they'll stop if they have their own factories, their own modernized economy, they'll stop relying upon the global hegemonic economy dominated by our ruling class. And that's bad, because right now, do our economy have the abilities? I mean, our previous couple presidents have been talking about taking jobs back to America a lot, but we've been so deindustrialized that we cannot really do that anymore. It's less profitable than what the capitalists have already been doing. I do believe that we could even benefit from doing collaborations with China on revamping our own infrastructure. Look at the railroads.
Mm-hmm.
For example, I remember that back a couple years, states like California, were able to negotiate a deal with China, to build a high-speed railroad, but it never come to pass. One part is because economy goes really bad, and the other is that it faced a lot of hostilities from the federal government, from politicians, from other states. So it wasn't really able to come to pass. If you compare China's railroad company and what their construction has been like to Norfolk South and other private railroad companies in the US, it's not even comparable. I've rode trains, I've seen freight trains in both countries. It's just worlds apart.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that I think we've seen just since 2012, 2013. China has developed just a tremendous amount of high-speed rail that's connecting cities, and we don't have. I mean, they've been talking about a high-speed train from LA to San Francisco for 15 years.
Oh yeah.
Still not there.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I mean, it is really, I think you make a really good point about the deindustrialized nature of the economy, the economies in the West, and just how much the US could benefit from infrastructure. I mean, that was something
but this basically happened This basically happened because, again, because of seizing super profit. The reason that countries in Southeast Asia and Latin America have been suffering, and they were basically locked into this lower levels of the whole economic chains, producing cheap labors, as China once also did, is because the industrial capitalists of the United States found that it is more profitable, it has more space to exploit the workers elsewhere than in the United States itself. So they do that, and basically everything goes kind of downhill from there. And when they wanted to come back, and when our people started to become discontent because we have crap infrastructure and we don't have enough jobs, the profit margin here is so small that the capitalists don't necessarily want to come back, so they rely upon this financial manipulations to still keep things going, but it's getting more and more unsustainable.
So what are the I guess the arguments of using the word imperialism to describe what China's doing, which is funny that would even happen. But
oh man,
I mean, these are some of the brainwashing kind of tactics that we hear. I mean,
yeah.
when you look at New York Times or CNN, China, we're just on the verge of war every time.
Oh no! Oh my God!
And yeah, it does. It comes back to profit and exploitation,
Yeah.
and it's really sad, honestly, just to see it and to realize how much better we would be if we did have international solidarity with China, with all the countries that are on our no list. no
Yeah,
list.
indeed. Because I mean, if you really look at it, the whole that trap narrative is a prime example of how our ruling class media and in collaboration with our government, because there have been State Department reports that admit that they commission the scholars and they buy off the medias to disseminate this kind of narrative, and they even hire narrative specialists. What even is that?
Right.
So through these kind of things, it is like really insanely easy to make the unwilling masses to see things that may or may not be there, and make them not see things that are there. So, for example, we're maybe going off topic a little bit.
Oh, that's all right.
Yeah, it was in I guess in mid-February that we even started to hear about the Ohio derailment thing in East Palestine, but that happened in early February. What was on the media back then? Balloon.
Yeah.
So this is basically how easy it is for our ruling class media to make us focus on things that probably doesn't really matter that much, and ignore things that really matters. So they can create buzzword narratives, spy balloons, debt trap, China imperialism, things like that, while not just basically stay silent about their own wrongdoings, and which is pretty rich coming from us, is because it's projection. It's basically everything that they accuse China have been doing. Most of them, if not all, the Western imperialists have been doing it themselves.
Yes, that is such an important point to make, and the thing that makes it just beyond hypocritical is just that the critiques are just go back in history, 50 years, 60 years, like we were doing it, but we were doing it in a more insidious and
and when there's less internet and less this kind of omnipresent propaganda. Yeah, and another way that our ruling class can do this is to separate the government and private capital, when in fact they're both the ruling class, they're in the same boat. Power dealing is legal in the US. Power dealing is not legal in China. It is called corruption.
So let's talk about the Trump era versus the Biden era, and how that has impacted relations with China. What are you seeing in Chinese media about the Biden administration, and how does that compare to what you were seeing about Trump?
Funnily enough, back then, I mean, back a couple years ago, there have been, I think it's more or less like a kind of dark humor kind of thing, but people were saying that they like Trump better because Trump and Biden are both carrying out this whole scheme of antagonizing China, but Trump was doing that a little bit more blatantly. But we could argue that while Trump might be doing that more blatantly than Obama, Biden, I'm not sure if Biden is doing it more discreetly or hiding it behind, so-called universal values and stuff. Biden is pretty blatant. He is basically carrying over all of the China policies that Trump has been having. So in this case, both the Democrat and the Republicans, they have the same interest in regards to in regards to punching down China.
Yeah, and that's the part that I was getting at is that we heard a lot about China when Trump was president.
Mm-hmm.
We're hearing a lot about China now.
Perhaps even more.
Perhaps even more, yes. And it's in relation to we're not hearing as much about the trade war now as much as we're hearing about this World War III scenario where China.
Yeah, the trade war is still going on, mind you.
Absolutely, and those tariffs that Trump put in place.
Mm-hmm.
In a lot of cases, that's still going on, just business as usual. Everything just kind of carries over from administration to administration.
Yeah, because I think in part that although Democrats and Republicans represent different sections of the ruling class, ultimately they share some interest in terms of holding this kind of hegemony over the rest of the world, and especially over developing countries and socialist countries.
So yeah, in terms of the ways that we can learn more about this, it's really hard with the constant brainwash that's going on. I don't know where to look. You go and find different resources and articles, and some of them are somewhat objective, like I said before, but it does seem like more research is needed. And I guess you as a person as a researcher, what are some strategies you use to identify the source and really what kind of ulterior motives a potential source might have?
So one of the way that I use, well, actually, I learned that from other analysts, because I mean, I'm a natural scientist, so a lot of time we have more trust in sources than perhaps researchers on politics and economy. So I am used to work with more objective sources, so I am extra vigilant when I look at sources on economy and politics that have like huge interest attached to them. So I think one really important thing is to have a kind of class analysis of who is of what class, who benefit from what in economic structure. And the other thing is that I think a lot of the time we tend to gravitate to the most easily accessible kind of sources, which is pretty much dominated by mainstream media. But if you look at things like governmental reports and even foreign language report or English language report from other countries that are not under the U.S. hegemony, you can probably see things that are relatively different, and you put a little bit more weight on it than you usually do, because I mean, even as I am a Chinese American, I am a minority, I still kind of default to this, the West and the US are more of an authority. So I actively try to correct that and to give it a grain of salt. So yeah, I think one thing that has been really useful for me is to I call it to decolonize my brain, decolonize my brain, to take away the kind of default that, the West are being the arbiter of moral and truth. It is pretty insidious, even for me. So we must remain vigilant and ask questions. So the questions that I ask is, first, where do these buzzword concepts come from? Where are the earliest sources? And it's not like even that hard. Sometimes if you even search on things like Wikipedia, which isn't the most unbiased platform ever, even there you can find some somewhat objective sources of where things come from. For example, I basically found out that the death trap diplomacy idea came from this one article in 2017 from an Indian think tank called Center of Policy Research, by a scholar called Brahmacharani. Hopefully I didn't butcher his name. So it's right there, but most people probably doesn't care that much about where these things come from. So if we care a little bit more about that, we get a little bit closer to truth. And second question is, who benefit from what? Who benefit from what? So basically, when we have a little bit of class analysis and understanding of what kind of economy people does, we kind of understand that maybe some parties that are claimed to have been able to mysteriously benefit from some schemes doesn't necessarily benefit from that, and it is indeed the other party that can benefit from it. So if there's no benefit, I think it's safe to say that it's probably fabricated by other parties through projection or through other means. And finally, when you see things that are just super hot potato in the media, you ask, do I see that because it's real, or because this is what our capitalist ruling class want us to see? I mean, and vice versa. Do I not see it because it's not real, or because it's been hidden?
So I think the class analysis part is key, and really looking at who benefits.
I mean, and that could probably take a whole nother episode.
It could. I mean, really, to do a deep dive into this, we could do several episodes, because
yeah. Well, I recommend everyone to search for a little segment from CGTN like 8 months or so ago. There, a scholar basically, and that scholar isn't even like working for a Chinese think tank or whatever. He is from an international think tank. He did a whole deep dive on how the U.S. State Department basically funded and disseminated themselves through U.S. embassies everywhere this whole debt trap diplomacy narrative. It's fascinating. So that could be an example of how people can start looking into where stuff come from.
Yes, what China, when they get criticized by this, that's some of the things that they point to. Obviously, they do call us out in our hypocrisy, and this is just sort of a smear campaign. And I think I found that clip that you are talking about, and we can include that in the show notes for sure.
Yeah, and I think the smear campaign really goes very well for us in the US. It's because the whole idea of China being this evil scheming empire that's going to take over the status quo and make us suffer and stuff, it lies in line with the deep-rooted racism about China that has its history ever since the middle 19th century, when our ruling class started to drum up this antagonism towards China, when China was back then a very weak and colonized and invaded country, and Chinese people that came from there to the U.S. and built some of our railroads that are probably still in use today, given what's going on now. They were the oppressed masses, but they were being framed as this evil scheming people that will take over, and that kind of cultural memory is still somewhat present in our brain today. So that is also part of why I say we need to decolonize our brain. Even Asian diaspora like me have this kind of lingering inferiority kind of idea in us. So it's pretty bad.
It just really goes to show the power of propaganda and what we grow up around and what we see in our day-to-day lives in the media, what we read, what we listen to, what we watch.
Yeah.
And these old, I mean, I was looking at archival photos for a project a while back, and it's specifically about railroads, and seeing some of those pictures and realizing that the racism is at the heart of a lot of the mistrust of China.
So I guess another way to really decolonize our brains to actually talk to people that that are living in China. A lot of us don't realize that Chinese young people all have all learned English to some degree. You can talk to them, and by humanizing each other, some of these can be alleviated a little bit. I mean, little by little, hopefully we can all break free from this kind of from this brainwashing that we unknowingly or basically tacitly being instilled in.
Yeah, the empathy and the humanizing has been sort of a theme in a lot of the this podcast's short life that it's had so far. Realizing that, like, I was just talking to Amiyat about sanctions earlier this week. And just how the it's like we don't see people in the countries that are affected as people, almost like we just they're seen as the enemy, and therefore they're not our fellow humans. And it is, and I love the decolonize my brain line. That is so perfect, because we're in a colonialized kind of mindset.
If we keep seeing peoples that's been portrayed as less than us, although it's not said explicitly, but they were in fact portrayed as less than us, as our as our subjects, as less than our equal. For example, I remember very clearly of a picture of the British ruled Hong Kong back in 19th century or maybe early 20th century. The picture is about an English woman, perhaps, I guess basically a Western woman, throwing food to the poor Chinese people on the streets, as if she is throwing food to pigeons. There have been a lot of pictures like that, and as a Chinese American person, it rends my heart every time I see things like that, and to see how my ancestor came from that kind of place, and in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. China suffered from sanctions from the United States and other Western countries as well. So basically my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation, they've been through that. So I was able to empathize with that kind of experience of, having so many years of colonizations and, later on other means of imperialist exploitation, how that looked like for a people. So I think I'm in a little bit more advantageous place to understand that. And I think one of my missions when I joined the CPUSA and become part of this solidarity initiative is to get myself out there and humanize the oppressed people, because I came from one of them.
I think that's really powerful, and it's the kind of thing that we can get there if we talk to each other, and if we sit down and understand that not everybody is going to look like us and think like us, and that we have a lot to learn. We have a lot to learn from each other.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's what Pants on Fire is for.
That's what it's for. That's it. We are up against a monster of propaganda fueled by
hatred and separation, segregation,
and just violence. I mean, the sheer violence of
the world is pretty much on the brink of violence. I mean, it's already in violence. is on the brink of more violence. As you know, these days I've heard some horror stories from news from Japan and Taiwan about how they were basically drumming up a war with China over Taiwan, and it's scary. It's really scary.
It is, and it doesn't have to be this way. And I think that's
it doesn't. Yeah, we could all have better schools, better hospitals, better roads. Yeah. As a Chinese saying goes, if you want to get rich, you build a road first. So yeah, they understand. They understand it. In order to flourish, in order to prosper, you have to build roads to connect. And that road, I believe that road is not just literal roads, but also metaphorical roads. Yeah, communication and solidarity really gets everyone out of the current funk.
Well, obviously we have a lot of work to do to get there.
Yeah.
But
yeah, for sure.
Having these conversations and really just getting people to ask the right questions is really important. And I want to thank you for coming on the show to talk about this. And I know we went all over the place, and I think it was good. Needed
to. Thank you for having me.
Well, where can people go to either keep up with what's going on in China? Are there any sources? You mentioned CG&T. Are there any?
CGTN.
CGTN.
It's China Global Television Network.
And are there any organizations that those of us in the US could involve ourselves in?
I'm a big fan of Dongsheng News. Ting's Track works there. She has a lot of good content. And also I am a big fan of the Friends of Socialist China organization. And it's not anything that's like governmental or official, but it's basically just a bunch of scholar media people that and activists that are not on board with all of these anti-China propaganda, and they come together and did that initiative to basically spread the word that socialist China is not our enemy, and we must work for peace and not conflict. Yeah, I would suggest people to subscribe to them. I think they all have YouTube channels and Twitter.
Excellent. All right. Well, is there anything else you wanted to share before we go?
Yeah, I think we went over most of the things that I kind of jot down. Yeah. So I guess just ask more questions. Have more empathy, and the voice of China and developing countries matter. And we're not like the sole arbiter of what's right and wrong. And that's kind of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, Emily, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you too.
Thank you for listening to Pants on Fire, Exposing Ruling Class Lies, the podcast produced by the International Department of CPUSA. Visit our website, cpusa.org, to learn more about the party. Follow us on Twitter at CPUSA Department, and subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast app.